He stood at his sister's coffin and made a promise to the entire world. He said he would protect her sons. He said he would shield them from the cold machinery of the institution that had broken her. He said the Spencer blood would see to it that Diana's boys were raised with warmth, with sensitivity, with humanity. For nearly 30 years, Charles Spencer kept that promise quietly, behind the walls of Althorp, out of the headlines, away from the cameras. But in early 2026, something happened that pushed him past his limit. And when Diana's brother finally spoke, the shockwave reached all the way to California. Welcome to Royal Report Daily. Today we are telling the full story of how Charles Spencer broke his silence, why he rejected the Sussex documentary proposal in the most devastating way possible, what it revealed about the fracturing relationship between Harry and the last people who were still quietly in his corner, and what all of it means for the future of the Sussex brand, the Netflix deal, and the ongoing battle over who gets to control Diana's legacy. This is a story about loyalty, about exploitation, about a brother trying to honor a promise, and about two very different people who both claim to love the same woman's memory. Let's get into it. To understand why Charles Spencer's intervention hit so hard, you first need to understand who he actually is. Because in the years since Diana's death, he has deliberately stayed in the background. And that deliberate invisibility means a lot of people have forgotten the kind of man they are dealing with. Charles Spencer is 62 years old. He is the 9th Earl Spencer. He is the youngest sibling of Diana, Princess of Wales. And he is the keeper of everything she left behind. Most people remember him from one moment. September 6, 1997. Westminster Abbey. 2 billion people watching around the world. A man standing at a microphone in front of the most powerful royal family on earth and saying things that no one in that building wanted to hear. His eulogy for Diana was not just a farewell. It was a challenge. Direct, public, and unmistakable. He looked at the institution that had, in his view, failed his sister, and he promised in front of the entire world that the Spencer family would make sure her sons did not suffer the same fate, that they would be raised with warmth, that they would know what it meant to be loved without condition, that the cold rigidity of royal life would not be allowed to define them the way it had defined and ultimately destroyed their mother. It was one of the most extraordinary public speeches of the 20th century, and Charles Spencer meant every single word of it. He backed that promise up immediately, starting with where Diana was buried. The expectation, the assumption held by almost everyone, was that Diana would be interred in the royal family vault, that the crown would have a say in how she was laid to rest, that even in death, she would belong to the institution. Charles said no. Diana was buried at Althorp, the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire, the house where she grew up, where she learned to ride horses, where she became the person the world fell in love with before the palace ever got its hands on her. The house that sits on 500 years of Spencer family land. Charles refused to let his sister leave his reach. Even in death, he brought her home. He kept her there, and he has been guarding her memory from that house ever since. For nearly 3 decades he watched. He stayed quiet. He let the world grieve and celebrate and argue and debate. He gave very few interviews. He made very few public statements. He maintained a silence that could easily be mistaken for absence. But Charles Spencer was never absent. He was watching. And in early 2026, what he saw finally pushed him into action. The signs had been building for years. And if you knew what to look for, the pattern was visible long before it became a crisis. It started, as so many things in the Sussex story do, with jewelry. When Meghan Markle attended the evening reception of her own wedding to Prince Harry in May 2018, she wore Diana's aquamarine ring on her right hand. It was a striking choice, deeply symbolic, and the message was clear to anyone watching. Here is a woman connecting herself to Diana's memory. Here is a woman stepping into that legacy. At first, Charles Spencer probably received that the way most people did, as a tribute, as a genuine expression of love for the woman Harry had lost when he was 12 years old, as something touching and appropriate. But then it kept happening. The butterfly earrings, the Cartier tank watch, the gold bracelets, every major appearance, every high-profile event, every moment guaranteed to attract a camera and a headline. There was a Diana piece attached to it, carefully chosen, deliberately placed. The public noticed. Royal commentators noticed. And slowly, what had initially felt like a tribute began to feel like something else. Like a strategy. like a calculated and recurring decision to associate Meghan's image with Diana's legacy in the public mind. Then came the Oprah interview in March 2021, and this is where things shifted significantly for Charles Spencer. Because anyone who had studied Diana's 1995 Panorama interview would have recognized, almost immediately, the architecture of what they were watching. Diana in 1995 sat in a softly lit room, speaking directly to camera, describing how she had been failed by the institution, how her mental health had been dismissed, how she had been silenced and isolated, how the establishment had closed every door and left her alone with no way out. It was a masterwork of emotional television. It was also, as we now know, obtained through forged documents and psychological manipulation. Meghan in 2021 sat in a softly lit garden, speaking directly to Oprah, describing how she had been failed by the institution, how her mental health had been dismissed, how she had been silenced and isolated, how the establishment had closed every door and left her alone with no way out. The parallels were not subtle. The architectural similarities between the two interviews were not accidental. And for Charles Spencer, watching from Althorp, what he saw was not a tribute to his sister. What he saw was the blueprint of Diana's pain being used as a template. And he knew exactly how that story ended. Then came the Netflix documentary series in late 2022. Harry and Meghan sitting in front of confessional cameras, building the narrative of a couple hunted by the same establishment that had destroyed Diana. The implication unmistakable. What happened to her is happening to us. We are the continuation of her story. We are the modern version of what she survived. It was compelling television. It was also, for Charles Spencer, deeply familiar in the worst possible way. Because Charles had watched his sister's real trauma be turned into entertainment in real time by people who did not care about her, who saw her pain as content, who used her vulnerability as a vehicle for their own ambitions. He had watched it happen. He had even, unknowingly, played a small role in enabling it. And it had haunted him ever since. Now he was watching it again. Different names, different decade, same architecture. The jewelry and the interviews and the documentaries were one thing. Charles could watch all of that from Althorp and stay quiet. Diana's memory was being commercially leveraged, but there was nothing that crossed a line he could directly act on. Until the documentary proposal arrived. And everything changed. By early 2026, the Sussex media operation was under serious pressure. The Spotify deal was long gone, having collapsed in 2023. The American Riviera Orchard lifestyle brand that Meghan had launched with considerable fanfare was struggling to gain the traction that had been predicted for it. And the Netflix deal, the $100 million agreement that had been the financial foundation of the Sussex brand since they left royal life, was coming under increasing scrutiny. The reviews for Meghan's lifestyle series with Love Meghan had been brutal, not mildly disappointing. Brutal. The Times gave it 2 stars and described it as surreally dull. The Daily Telegraph gave it 2 stars and called it an exercise in narcissism. The Guardian, which had long been sympathetic to Meghan and had previously published pieces condemning the royal family's treatment of her, gave it 1 star and described it as toe-curlingly unlovable television. The Evening Standard, which gave it 4 stars, still ended up mocking it in the body of the review. One editor said she was simply confused about who the show was aimed at. Media experts had already been saying publicly that the Netflix deal was due to expire and that renewal was far from guaranteed. The streaming giant had reportedly decided against renewing the contract. And Meghan was, according to multiple sources, desperately searching for a project that would justify her continued presence on the platform and remind the world why the Sussex name still mattered. Someone in the Sussex camp came up with an idea. A documentary about Diana, timed to coincide with the 30th anniversary of her death in 2027. On paper, it made a certain kind of sense. 30 years of unanswered questions. 30 years of public grief and fascination. A woman whose story the world has never stopped wanting to understand. A cinematic tribute, emotional and definitive, would have attracted enormous global attention. Netflix reportedly loved the concept immediately. But then came the angle that made the project truly irresistible to the people pitching it, and also the angle that made it catastrophically flawed. The documentary was not going to be just about Diana. It was going to draw a direct line between Diana's fight against the establishment and Meghan's fight against the same forces. It was going to position Meghan as the modern continuation of Diana's story. the 21st century version of the woman who refused to be silenced. The heir to her spirit, her courage, her defiance. It was bold. It was ambitious. It was exactly the kind of high-concept framing that streaming platforms love. And it had one enormous, unavoidable problem. To make it work, they needed Charles Spencer. Not just his blessing, his active participation. They wanted Althorp itself as the filming backdrop. They wanted access to private family archives. They reportedly wanted Diana's personal handwritten diaries, home movies that have never been released publicly, the intimate and private Diana that nobody outside the Spencer family has ever had access to. Without Charles, there was no documentary. There was just another retelling of a story already told 100 times, with no new material, no exclusive access, and no legitimacy. So the Sussex team went to Charles Spencer with the proposal. They brought Netflix's enthusiasm with them. They brought the 30th anniversary hook. They brought the full pitch. They almost certainly believed he would say yes. Charles Spencer read the proposal. He understood the architecture immediately. He saw exactly what role Meghan was designed to play. He saw how Diana's private pain and personal archives were going to be used as the raw material for a project that was fundamentally about rehabilitating and elevating someone else's brand. His response was 4 words. Is this a joke? When Charles Spencer calls something a joke, it means something very specific. This is not a man who speaks carelessly. This is not a man who makes public statements without weighing their consequences. This is a man who has spent 29 years protecting his sister's legacy with extraordinary discipline. His rejection was not just a no. It was a statement of contempt for what was being proposed. And the reason his rejection hit so hard, the reason it sent shockwaves through the Sussex camp that had not been anticipated, was because of who Charles Spencer is in relation to Diana's legacy. He is not a palace official. He cannot be dismissed as the establishment protecting itself. He is Diana's blood. He is the man who stood at her funeral and made a promise in front of 2 billion people. He is the keeper of everything she left behind. When he calls a project a joke, he is speaking with an authority that no one else on earth possesses. And there was no rebuttal to it. No counterargument. No way to frame his rejection as institutional gatekeeping or royal censorship. He had simply looked at the proposal and decided that his sister's private pain and personal legacy were not available to be used as the supporting material for someone else's brand revival. The documentary was effectively dead. There is a layer to Charles Spencer's decision that goes beyond professional judgment. It goes into something deeply personal, something that has shaped everything he has done since 1997. Charles Spencer carries a specific guilt about his sister's Panorama interview, a guilt that those close to him say has never fully left him. He was the one who introduced Diana to the journalist behind that interview, the meeting that set in motion one of the most significant moments of Diana's public life. At the time, it seemed like it might help her. It seemed like Diana needed a way to speak directly to the public, to have her story heard on her own terms. What Charles did not know, and what the rest of the world would not fully understand until an official inquiry decades later, was that the journalist had forged documents to gain Diana's trust, had used psychological manipulation, had exploited a woman who was emotionally vulnerable and desperate to be believed, and had turned her vulnerability into television. Diana was in pain, and someone used that pain as content. When the full truth came out, it hit Charles Spencer hard. He had played a role, however unintentional, however genuinely well-meaning his intentions had been. He had been part of the chain of events that led to his sister being exploited. He has spent every year since making absolutely certain that nothing like that ever happens to Diana's memory again. The private diaries stay private. The home movies stay sealed. The intimate details of who she really was, away from the cameras and the palace and the public, those belong to the family. And they will stay with the family. So when he looked at the Sussex documentary proposal and saw the same fundamental dynamic, a vulnerable legacy being turned into entertainment, private pain being converted into content, he did not need a moment of deliberation. He had lived through the consequences of that dynamic once. He was not going to enable it again. What happened next is where the story gets even more layered. Because Charles Spencer did not make his move in isolation. Sources close to the palace have described a communication that Charles Spencer sent to Prince William. A letter, careful in its language, serious in its intent. William had been privately furious about the commercialization of his mother's image for years. Every interview that invoked Diana, Every documentary that framed her memory as a mirror for someone else's struggle. Every piece of jewelry worn at a calculated moment to draw a calculated association. William had watched all of it, and it had quietly enraged him. But William is the future King of England. He cannot simply call a press conference and announce that his brother's media projects are disrespectful to their mother's memory. He cannot publicly block a Netflix documentary without it becoming a global headline about palace censorship and royal family warfare. Every move he makes carries institutional weight. And institutional weight has institutional consequences. Charles Spencer does not have that constraint. Charles Spencer is not a working royal. He is a private individual who happens to be Diana's brother. When he rejects something, it is not the establishment protecting itself. It is family honor. Pure, simple, and unchallengeable. In his letter to William, Charles reportedly laid out his concerns with unusual directness. He expressed worry that the royal family's sustained silence on the Sussex situation was allowing Harry and Meghan to control the global narrative without any effective counter. That traditional royal values were being steadily dismantled in the public consciousness while the palace said nothing. That Harry, in particular, had been allowed to drift so far from the man he was raised to be that the international media had no longer recognized him as a prince or a statesman, but as a reactive, emotionally fragile figure entirely consumed by the narrative his wife was building around them both. Charles was not, according to those familiar with the letter, asking William to forgive Harry or to open the doors to reconciliation. He was making a strategic argument. That silence from the future king was not neutral, that it was actively ceding ground, and that the ground being ceded was not just personal but institutional. For William, the letter reportedly landed with weight. Not because it changed his feelings about Harry, which sources suggest have shifted over the years from grief and fury to something closer to cold indifference, but because it came from the man who had stood at his mother's funeral and promised to look after him. And because on some level, William knew Charles was right. The public response to all of this has been exactly what you would expect when Diana is involved. Deeply divided, passionately argued, and impossible to reduce to a simple verdict. There are people who believe Charles Spencer did the right thing. That Diana's story has been told enough times. That turning the 30th anniversary of her death into a Netflix production centered on rehabilitating the Sussex brand is not a tribute. It is a commercial transaction dressed up as one. That Diana's private letters and home movies and handwritten diaries deserve to stay exactly where they are. That her anniversary should be a moment for reflection and grief, not a content opportunity. These voices tend to align themselves with William, with the idea that protecting Diana's legacy means keeping parts of it genuinely protected, not just strategically managed. Then there are people who believe Harry has every right to be involved in telling his mother's story. That Diana shaped both her sons equally. That Harry's grief is real, his memories are real, and his perspective on who she was carries genuine historical value. That blocking his participation in a Diana documentary is yet another example of the establishment telling him what he is and is not allowed to do with his own family history. These voices tend to align with the idea that Harry is being silenced, again, by the same forces that silenced his mother. The reality, as is almost always the case with stories this complex, does not fall cleanly on either side. Harry's grief for his mother is genuine. No one who has watched him speak about her over the years can doubt that. The loss of Diana when he was 12 years old shaped him in ways that are still visible in everything he does. But a documentary is not just grief. A documentary is a product. It is produced by teams of writers and executives and producers with commercial objectives. It involves decisions about framing and narrative and what story is being told, and in whose interest that story is being told. And the framing that was proposed for this particular documentary, Diana as the precursor to Meghan, Diana's fight as the prelude to Meghan's fight, Diana's legacy as the legitimizing foundation for the Sussex brand, that framing was not primarily about Diana. Charles Spencer saw that, and he made his decision accordingly. And so where does everything stand now? The documentary is dead. The Sussex media operation is under the most significant pressure it has faced since they left royal life. The Netflix deal is either expired or in serious jeopardy, depending on which sources you believe. The lifestyle brand is underperforming. The critical reception to recent Sussex content has been, by any objective measure, genuinely damaging. Harry's attempts at reconciliation with the royal family continue in their quiet, complicated way. He has reportedly sent representatives to meet with palace communications staff. He has offered to share his diary with family members to demonstrate transparency and good faith. There are people inside the institution who believe a path back for Harry, personally, is not impossible. But Meghan is a different calculation. The trust deficit between Meghan and the royal family, according to sources close to the palace, has not shifted. The specific fear that any private conversation, any personal moment, any attempt at genuine reconnection will eventually become material for the next production remains the central and immovable obstacle. For the royal family, the Sussex situation has been fully processed. The titles question is settled. The succession question is settled. The documentary question is settled, at least for now. For Harry and Meghan, the question of what comes next is genuinely open. They are wealthy. They are globally recognized. They have a life in California that exists entirely outside the royal system, and that will continue to exist there regardless of what the palace does or does not do. But the thing they have built their public identity around, the Diana connection, the legacy legitimacy, the idea that their story is a continuation of something larger and more important than celebrity, that thing just got significantly harder to maintain. Because Diana's brother read the proposal, and he said 4 words, "Is this a joke?" And in those 4 words, Charles Spencer did what he has been doing quietly for 29 years. He protected his sister from people who wanted to use her pain as a vehicle, from a narrative that would have served everyone involved except the woman at the center of it, from the same dynamic he had watched destroy her once before. He brought her home. Again, Diana's legacy will outlast all of this. It will outlast the Netflix deals and the documentary pitches and the jewelry moments and the carefully staged interviews. It will outlast the Sussex brand and the palace communication strategies and the public arguments about who loved her more and who has the right to tell her story. It will outlast all of it because Diana was genuinely extraordinary. Not because of the institution she married into, not because of the title she was given and eventually stripped of, but because of who she was as a human being. The woman who walked into AIDS wards when the rest of the world was walking away. The woman who brought her sons to homeless shelters so they would understand the real cost of privilege. The woman who refused, even at the cost of everything, to stop being herself. That Diana, the real Diana, the private Diana, the Diana who wrote in her diaries and filmed herself at home and shared herself completely only with the people she trusted most. That Diana is at Althorp, kept safe by the brother who promised, and she is staying there. That is all for today here at Royal Report Daily. If you want to stay ahead of every development in this story as it continues to unfold, subscribe to the channel right now and turn on your notifications. The royal world never stops moving, and we will be here every single time it does.